At the age of 68, Vince Gill stands on stage like a living monument of country music. A man who has spent more than 4 decades building a career that few can touch. With more than 20 Grammy Awards, a number that makes him one of the most honored artists in country history, along with a long list of awards from the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music, where he has not only won, but has also been recognized as a standard of artistic quality and integrity. Songs like When I Call Your Name, I Still Believe in You, or Go Rest High on That Mountain are not just hits, but have become part of America's collective memory, echoing in the joyful and sorrowful moments of millions of people. He's a longtime member of the Grand Ole Opry, where only voices with real value are allowed to stand among the ranks. And later, he was invited to join the Eagles, one of the greatest bands of all time, replacing Glenn Frey's trust that not every artist could receive. All of that creates the image of a man who has reached the peak, beloved, respected, and seemingly having everything an artist could dream of. But behind all that glory is another story, quieter and heavier, a story not told with applause, but with long silences, where Vince Gill has had to face things that no award could erase. The years he could not be with his family when they needed him most, the broken marriage with Janice Oliver, the feeling of standing in the middle of success, yet realizing he had lost things that could not be replaced. The times he came home and realized his daughter had grown up without him by her side, the words left unsaid, and the moments that could not be redone. And even though he has tried to rebuild his life and found love with Amy Grant, that regret has never completely disappeared. It has only changed shape, becoming part of the way he sings, the way he lives, and the way he continues to step onto the stage every night. Not as a perfect man, but as someone who has understood the price of success and still chooses to stand strong, still raises his voice, as if every song is a way for him to face the past and prove that even though there are things that cannot be fixed, he can still keep living, keep loving, and keep singing. Before we move on to what he had to give up to achieve all of that, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way of respect for a man who has quietly endured more than the world has ever seen. In the Oklahoma of the simple but not at all easy years, where a boy grew up in a family with music, but also full of invisible pressures that he was not old enough at the time to name, Vince was not born into harsh poverty like many other stories, but that does not mean his childhood was easy, because in that house, music was not just joy. It was almost a standard, a measure of value, especially under the influence of his father, a lawyer who carried a deep love for music, a stern man of few words who rarely showed emotions in a way a child could understand and feel. He was not the type to pat on the shoulder or say gentle words of encouragement, but the type to set expectations. The type who believed that if you did something, you had to do it really well. And in that way of raising him, Vince learned discipline, but also learned how to hide his weaknesses. From very early on, that boy was handed a guitar, then a banjo, a mandolin, and any instrument that could make sound, as if music was not a choice, but a path already set. And Vince walked that path not because he was sure he wanted to, but because it was the only way he felt he was doing the right thing, getting closer to something he did not fully understand. The long hours of practice, the times he had to play a musical passage over and over until it was perfect, not only honed his skills, but also quietly created something deeper, a feeling that he was only recognized when he did well. That love and acceptance were sometimes tied to whether he was good enough or not. And then, amid all of that, life could not avoid the losses that a child should never have to face too soon. When the family went through upheavals and sudden departures that left in Vince an emptiness that no one really knew how to fill. He was not the type to cry loudly or show pain on the outside because he had gotten used to keeping everything inside. But that did not mean he did not feel it deeply. On the contrary, that very silence made everything even heavier, as if every sadness did not disappear but only settled down, accumulated, waiting for a day to be lifted in another form. And that was when music began to change its meaning for him, not just notes or exercises anymore, but the only place where Vince could put the emotions he could not put into words. The place where he could be sad without explanation, could remember without naming, could feel without fear of judgment. When he played, when he sang, something inside him was released, not completely, but enough to keep going, enough to endure one more day. And gradually, music was no longer something he did to be recognized, but something that kept him connected to himself, like a thin but resilient thread connecting a growing boy to everything he had been through and had never really spoken about. And perhaps it was in those years, when there were no stages, no lights, no fame, that Vince Gill unconsciously learned something he would carry with him throughout his life. That sometimes the greatest pains are not what the world sees, but what a person quietly keeps inside, and music, no matter how beautiful, can only be a way to live with them, never completely erase them. Those years did not end with any brilliant turning point, but stretched into a long chain of days in which Vince Gill gradually realized that playing an instrument well did not mean being seen, and singing a note correctly did not mean anyone would listen, because when he stepped out of the small space of his family and practice sessions, he began entering a world where talent was not always recognized, where louder, more standout, or simply more confident people usually captured the attention first, while Vince, with his quiet nature and unshowy way of performing, often stood in the background, not because he lacked ability, but because he did not know how to put himself forward. In those early bands, he was not the lead voice, not the one mentioned when the audience left, but the one standing beside, playing every note accurately, yet nearly invisible, as if his perfection made him even easier to overlook in a world that loved things that were bold and easy to notice. The performances passed, the small rooms, the audiences who did not remember names, and after each one, Vince carried with him a feeling that was hard to name, not a clear failure, but a kind of faint existence, as if he was doing everything right but still not enough to make a difference. And then the rejections began to come, not loudly, but enough to leave marks, gentle but cold words like, "Good, but not quite what we're looking for," or glances that passed over without stopping, all adding up to a message that he gradually came to believe was true, that he was not special enough, that no matter how hard he tried, he would only stop at good and never reach irreplaceable. The hardest part was not being rejected once, but the feeling of being rejected over and over until it became part of how he saw himself, when every time he stepped on stage, instead of thinking about what he could do, Vince began thinking about what he might do wrong, about whether he was good enough, about whether this time would be any different from the times before. The fear of failure did not come like a storm, but crept in slowly, clinging to every thought, making him more hesitant, more cautious, and sometimes making him withdraw even when opportunities appeared. Because deep inside, a part of him had grown used to not being chosen, used to standing in the back, used to not being the one called. But the saddest thing was not that the world did not see him, but that he began to see himself that way, as if his worth always needed confirmation from the outside. And when that confirmation did not come, he was left only with silence and questions without answers. And in those long nights after the shows, when everyone had gone home and the last sound had faded, Vince would sit alone with his guitar, playing melodies that no one heard, not to practice, but to find something that had been lost through all those attempts. The feeling that music had once been a place he belonged to, before it became a place where he had to prove he deserved to be. And it was precisely in that contradiction between loving music and fearing he was not good enough in music that something new gradually took shape, not confidence, but a quiet kind of persistence. When he kept going, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because stopping might be even more frightening. Because stopping meant admitting that those rejections were right, that the feeling of invisibility was permanent, And Vince Gill, though still very young, had begun to understand that some paths are not walked with certainty, but by accepting to keep going, even when no one sees you, even when you yourself do not fully believe you will get anywhere. And then, as if carried along by a current he did not fully control, Vince Gill continued to move forward, but not as a leader, but as someone standing in the back, quietly contributing to others' success. While he himself had not yet found a clear place, those years passed in bands, in recording sessions, in tours where his name was not in the position the audience remembered, but only part of a larger whole, where everything worked well, but nothing truly belonged to him alone. And the irony was that Vince did it very well, too well, to the point that he became someone everyone wanted to work with. A precise guitarist, a perfect supporting voice, a person who always knew what to do to make the song more complete, but that very perfection pushed him further from the center, because in a world where difference was noticed, Vince blended in too well with everything around him, to the point that he nearly disappeared inside the music he created. Names like Pure Prairie League appeared in that journey not as destinations but as stopping points, where he had the chance to express himself but still not enough to define him. Songs were released, tours were done, applause rang out and then faded, all creating a feeling that he was moving forward. But it was unclear where he was going, as if every step was right, but did not lead to any specific place. Time passed without noise, without big falls, but also without clear leaps forward, only years of accumulation. Days following one another in the studio, on stage, on long roads, where Vince continued doing what he knew he could do. But deep inside, a question began to grow, whether this was all there was or only part of something he had not yet reached. His youth was not wasted in an obvious way, with no big mistakes, no decisions that destroyed everything, but it was consumed in a different, quieter way, as each year passed without any moment truly belonging to him alone, as opportunities came and went without leaving a deep enough mark to change how the world saw him, and that gradually created an indescribable feeling, not failure, but drifting, as if he was living a life where he was only a supporting part. And in all of that, the scariest thing was not that others did not recognize him, but that he began not to recognize himself. When music, the thing that had once been where he found himself, became where he lost it. When every time he stepped on stage, he was no longer sure whether he was expressing his true self or just fulfilling a predefined role. Those long nights in the studio, when everyone had left and only the sound of the strings and his own breathing remained, Vince began to feel that emptiness more clearly, a void that no praise or small success could fill, because deep inside he knew he was heading in the right direction but not on his own true path. And it was precisely in this period, when there was no spotlight to cover it, when there was no big success to distract, that Vince Gill gradually faced a truth he could not avoid, that if he continued like this, he might have a stable enough, safe enough career, but he would never have a real identity, would never have the feeling that he had lived fully with what he had, and that, in a way, was even scarier than failure, because it did not destroy you right away, but wore you down little by little, until you were no longer sure who you had been in the first place. And then, after all those years of drifting in the role of someone standing in the back, the thing Vince Gill had once waited for, even at times not daring to believe he would reach, finally came, not loudly at first, but clearly enough to completely change the trajectory of his life, when his solo career began to open a door that had previously seemed always closed. And with the album When I Call Your Name, the name Vince Gill was no longer just a shadow behind other artists, but became a voice that was recognized, a person who was listened to, a story that the public began to care about. And for the first time in many years, he no longer had to wonder whether he was good enough, because the applause, the praise, and especially the awards, including those prestigious Grammys, answered for him, like a recognition he had pursued in silence through nearly all of his youth. But what no one told him, and perhaps he himself did not realize right away, was that achieving the dream did not mean everything became easier. But sometimes it was only the beginning of another kind of pressure, heavier, more persistent, and harder to escape. The schedule began to grow dense. Tours followed one after another. Cities changed constantly. Nights standing under the stage lights where he had to repeat the same emotion, the same perfection, as if every show was the first time. And while the audience saw a man living his dream, Vince began to feel the price of maintaining that dream when time no longer belonged to him. When days grew shorter and moments of quiet nearly disappeared, his personal life, which had already been fragile before, now began to shrink noticeably, not because he did not care, but because he no longer had enough time to be present in the way his loved ones needed. When every return home was only a short break between two trips, when conversations became rushed, when moments that should have been shared were replaced by promises of next time. And the sad thing was that those next times did not always come. The first signs of the trade-off did not appear as a shock, but crept into every small detail. When he began to realize he was missing the stage more than home, when the applause became more familiar than the voices of his loved ones, when being recognized by thousands of strangers gradually became what filled the space that only family should have filled. And in all of that, there was a paradox Vince could not avoid, that the more successful he became, the more he had to move away from the things that had once made him feel safe, that the more he was loved by the public, the more he risked losing connection with those who loved him most. And even though he never actively chose to trade, each small decision, each trip, each opportunity accepted, all gradually created a distance that at some point he no longer knew where to begin to close. There were nights, after the lights went out and the audience had left, when Vince sat alone with his guitar, not to practice or prepare for the next show, but just to find a familiar feeling, something not controlled by schedules or expectations, a moment when he could be himself without needing to prove anything. And in those rare moments, perhaps he began to realize that the dream he had pursued for so many years did not only bring him everything he had once wanted, but also quietly took away things whose value he had not yet realized, until they began to disappear. And that was the moment, even though he did not say it, even though he did not fully admit it, that a new worry began to form inside him. Not the fear of failure like before, but the fear that in the process of achieving everything, he might be gradually losing the things that no success could replace. And while Vince Gill's career continued to expand with opportunities he had only dared to imagine before, in another corner of his life, a different story was quietly unfolding. A story without stage lights, without applause, but a place where he was supposed to belong more than anywhere else. The small family he had built with Janice Oliver in those early years, when both still believed that love and music could walk side by side without hurting each other. Their early days did not have much money or big fame, but they had something that later became rarer presence: simple evenings together, conversations not interrupted by phones or schedules, and a very real belief that no matter how difficult the road ahead was, they would walk through it together. When their daughter was born, that joy seemed even more complete, as if every effort, every year of waiting had led to this moment. When Vince first held his little child in his arms and felt a responsibility greater than any stage, a love that needed no proof but demanded constant presence, whose full meaning he did not yet understand at the time. But then, like many other things in his life, that happiness did not disappear immediately, but gradually changed in a way that was hard to notice, as his career demanded more and more, as tours grew longer, as performances followed one after another, making time at home short and rushed. At first, it was just trips away for a few days, then a few weeks, then longer, and each time he returned, Vince still brought love for his family and tried to make up for it with small gestures. But there was one thing he could not make up for: The time that had passed while he was not there, while he stood on stage being listened to by thousands. At home, Janice Oliver began to carry more than what they had once shared, not because she wanted to, but because there was no other choice, as raising their child, caring for the family, and keeping everything running normally gradually became a responsibility she handled almost alone. And even though there were no big complaints or loud arguments, silence began to appear, not as peace, but as a gap growing wider between two people who had once been so close. Vince was not someone who deliberately left his family, but every decision to take another tour, every time he chose to stay an extra day for work, unintentionally pulled him a little farther away, until that distance was no longer temporary, but became part of their life. There were nights he came home, stepped into the familiar space, but felt like a guest, when everything was still there but no longer belonged to him, the way it had before, when his daughter had grown a little more and he had not noticed in time, when family stories continued without him there to witness them. And the most painful thing was not that he was not welcomed, but that everyone had learned to live without him being there regularly anymore. The distance did not come from one specific event, but from hundreds and thousands of small moments that accumulated, from the missed times, the delays, the thoughts of there will be time later, until he himself began to realize that the closeness they once had was no longer intact. That love was still there, but no longer being nurtured the way it needed. And in that long silence, Vince Gill gradually understood something no one had told him when he started his journey: that there are things that do not disappear immediately when we leave, but if we do not return in time, one day we will realize they have changed forever. And then it is not that there is no more love, but that there is no way to go back to the way it was before. And it was precisely from those seemingly invisible distances that Vince Gill's life began to split into two parts that would never truly meet again. One side, the brightly lit stages where he was, always present at the right time in the right role, and the other side, the everyday moments where his absence gradually became familiar, not because people accepted it, but because there was no other way except to keep living with it. There were birthdays when he could only call home from a strange city, his voice trying to stay cheerful while on the other end was his daughter's laughter that he could not see directly. There were school performances, small events that for a child were the whole world, but the seat for the father remained empty, not because he did not want to come, but because he was standing somewhere else, doing what he believed was necessary for the family's future, yet not realizing that that future was happening right in front of his eyes and passing day by day. His daughter grew up in those gaps, not completely without love, but lacking presence, lacking the small moments whose value people only understand when they are gone, and over time, she began to learn not to wait, to go through things alone that should have been shared. And the most painful part was that this adaptation happened in silence, without blame or clear anger, only a subtle change in the way she saw her father, not as someone who was always there, but as someone who appeared occasionally and then left again. Each time Vince returned home, he brought all the exhaustion from the trips, but also a simple desire to return to the role of a father and a husband. But the reality he faced was not what he had imagined, when the space was the same, but the rhythm of life had changed. When conversations were no longer as natural as before, when questions became shorter, when closeness had to be found again instead of simply existing. There were evenings he sat in the living room, looking around and realizing he was trying to catch up on a story he had missed too many chapters of, that the small details in his daughter's life, the things he should have known, had become unfamiliar. And in that moment, a heavy feeling began to form, not an explosive regret, but a slow realization that the distance had gone too far to be easily closed. What made everything harder was not that he did not recognize the problem, but that he did not know where to begin to change it. Because every time he tried to get closer, he had to leave again for work. Every time he thought he would spend more time, The schedule pulled him back to the stages that were waiting, and gradually he became trapped between two worlds that both demanded him completely but did not allow him to belong to both at the same time. The regret did not come immediately like a big wave, but accumulated through each missed time, each next time, each departure with the thought that he would return sooner. And over time, those things were no longer separate events, but became a constant feeling, part of how he saw himself when he began to wonder whether everything he was doing was truly worth it if the price was moments he could never get back. There were nights, after finishing a successful show, when the applause still echoed in his ears. Vince sat alone in a hotel room, not to enjoy the success, but to think about what he had missed that day, about the things happening at home that he could not witness, and in that silence, he began to understand that there are distances that cannot be measured in miles, but in unshared moments, memories not created together. And once they have passed, there is no way to go back, no way to live them again, only to carry them as part of the story he would have to continue living with, whether he wanted to or not. And then, after all those long silences that no one really named, the thing Vince Gill had probably felt for a very long time finally became an unavoidable truth. His marriage to Janice Oliver came to an end. Not with a storm, not with words that hurt each other, but with a distance that had lasted too long to mend, as if both had tried for many years to hold on to something, but at some point they were only holding on to the memory of it rather than truly living in it anymore. There was no specific moment when everything collapsed, no single event big enough to point to and say, this is the reason. Only hundreds and thousands of days when the distance grew larger, until silence became more familiar than conversations, and when two people who had once been so close realized they no longer knew what to say to each other. The decision to divorce did not come from anger, but from a quiet acknowledgement that everything had changed, that love might still be somewhere, but was no longer enough to keep them in the same life. And perhaps precisely because there was no big conflict or clear blame, that ending felt even heavier, because it did not allow anyone to feel right or wrong, but only left a feeling of emptiness, as if something important had gradually disappeared without anyone noticing until it was gone. The day Vince left the house they had once built together was not a special day in the way people usually think of separations, with no dramatic suitcases or slamming doors, only an almost complete silence where everything was still in its place. Furniture, memories, traces of a life that had once been very real, but their meaning had changed forever. He took what was necessary, but there were things he could not take. Not because he did not want to, but because they no longer belonged to him in that way. Habits, ordinary evenings, moments he had once thought would always exist. And then there was an image he would never forget. A moment that did not last long but was deep enough to etch into memory like an indelible mark. His daughter, standing in the back, saying nothing, just watching as he left, with no loud tears or words to hold him back, only a silence that contained everything that could not be said. Vince did not turn back immediately, not because he did not want to, but because a part of him understood that if he stopped too long, he might not have the strength to keep walking. And perhaps that was one of the hardest moments in his life. Not because he did not know what he was doing, but because he knew very clearly its price and still had to do it. After that day, his life did not stop. The shows continued, the songs were still sung, the public still saw a familiar Vince Gill, a man whose voice could touch others' hearts. But something had changed that no one could see from the outside, a feeling of loss that could not be defined in words. Not losing everything, but losing the most important thing among all he had ever had. He did not talk much about the divorce, did not try to explain or justify, because there are stories that cannot be told completely without losing their meaning. And perhaps he did not need to speak, because what he felt was clear enough in the way he lived afterward, in the silences between songs, in the moments he paused a little longer before raising his voice. Some people leave and come back as if nothing has changed. But for Vince, the day he stepped out of that house was a boundary he never truly crossed. Because even if he built a new life, even if he kept moving forward, there was always a part of him that remained behind. In that house, in that moment, with the image of a child standing quietly watching, like an unfading reminder that there are decisions that not only change the present, but also shape how we look back at ourselves for the rest of our lives. After all that had broken and could not be mended, Vince Gill did not step into a new chapter of his life with the relief people might imagine, but carried with him everything that was still unfinished, like invisible baggage he could not set down. And it was precisely in that state that he met Amy Grant, a woman who also did not come from a complete story, who also carried cracks from a past marriage, who also understood what it meant to smile in front of the public, while inside she was not entirely at peace. They did not meet as two people looking for something new, but as two people who had been through enough to realize that what they needed was no longer perfection, but understanding, a place where they could exist without having to explain too much. A connection not built on glamour, but on the truth that both had once lost something important. But precisely because of that, their relationship from the beginning was not viewed in the way they felt it, because, to the outside world, this was not a story of two people finding each other after heartbreak, but a story placed into easier-to-judge molds, two broken marriages, two familiar names, and a relationship appearing at a time when many people were not ready to accept it. The pressure did not come from one side, but from everywhere. From the media, from articles that did not need to understand the story, but were still ready to draw conclusions, from fans who had once loved their previous images and did not easily accept the change, from glances not direct but clear enough to make them understand they were being judged. There were words written as absolute truth, comments that needed no verification, ways of naming that turned a very human relationship into something simplified into right or wrong. And in all of that, Vince was not someone who reacted strongly, did not step forward to explain, did not try to argue to defend himself, but chose a different way to face it. Silence. That silence was not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that there were things that, no matter how explained, would not be seen in the way he hoped, that there were stories that could only be understood from the inside, and the more one tried to bring them out, the easier they were to distort. But silence did not mean not feeling, and every criticism, every glance, every way his story was retold in a different version left some mark, not an explosive wound, but a lingering, heavy feeling. When he began to wonder whether what he was building was truly worth it, if it had to begin from the pain caused to others, if this new happiness always came with the memory of what had been lost. Amy was there too, not as a perfect answer, but as someone walking with him through days that were not easy, where they had to learn to exist in a world that did not fully accept them, where every moment of peace had to be protected from the noise outside. And in that companionship, Vince gradually realized that love sometimes is not something everyone understands and supports, but something that exists despite those things, not to prove anything but simply to continue. He did not try to change the way the world saw him, did not try to rewrite the story that had been told, but accepted that there would always be parts of his life that would be misunderstood, always viewed through others' lenses. And the only thing he could do was to keep living with what he knew was true, even if that meant carrying judgments he did not choose. And perhaps it was precisely in this period, between the non-stop words from outside and the silence he kept for himself, that Vince Gill learned something else about life, that not every love arrives at the perfect time, not every story is told fairly, and sometimes the hardest thing is not finding someone to love, but holding on to it when the whole world seems not to stand on your side. And then, after the years of having to go through judgment and silence, Vince Gill did not try to return to the person of the past, but began to learn how to keep living with what he had, little by little rebuilding a new life beside Amy Grant, not as a perfect replacement, but as a chance to start again in a more careful, slower, and truer way. They did not enter the marriage with illusions that everything would be easy, because both understood very clearly the price of what they had been through, and precisely because of that, their peaceful days were not loud, did not need to be shown off, but existed in small details: a morning without a dense schedule, a dinner not interrupted by work, conversations that did not have to end in a hurry. For Vince, those seemingly ordinary things carried special meaning, as if he was relearning how to be present, how to stay a little longer, how to listen without being pulled away by other responsibilities. And in those rare moments he could feel a kind of peace that before he had thought he did not need or did not have time to hold on to. But even as the new life gradually stabilized, the past did not disappear. It did not stay quietly behind, but followed him into the present, slipping into every thought, every choice, like an inseparable part of the person he had become. One of the things he could not leave behind was his relationship with his daughter, something he understood clearly he had lost more of than could be measured. And because of that, he began to try, not with grand gestures, but with patience, with showing up more when he could, with listening more instead of just talking, as if he was trying to piece back together the fragments that time had scattered. But there were limits that no matter how hard he tried, he could not cross. Not because of a lack of love, but because there were years that had passed without him there, memories that had been formed without his presence, and even if he could create new moments, he could not replace what had been lost. That was not always said out loud, but existed in the silences between them, in the way they looked at each other, in conversations that sometimes stopped before reaching deeper things, as if both understood that there were things better left unexplained, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too big to put into words. Vince did not run from that, but also could not completely face it in the way he wished. And it was precisely in that tension that he gradually learned to accept that rebuilding did not mean erasing what had happened, but finding a way to live with it without letting it break. What remained? Life with Amy gave him a support, a place where he could be himself without needing to prove anything. But even in that peace, there were still moments when he paused a little longer, when an old memory suddenly returned, when a song evoked a different time, a different person. And in those moments he was no longer the man standing in the present, but someone looking back at his choices from a distance that could no longer be changed. And perhaps the hardest thing was not that he had lost something, but that he had to continue living with that understanding, every day, in every decision, in every moment, like a part of the person he could not separate from. But even so, he kept going, not because everything had been resolved, but because he understood that stopping would not make things better, that the only thing he could do was try to live better with what he had, love more when he could, and accept that an imperfect life did not mean it had no value, but only meant it needed to be lived more sincerely, even if that came with pains that would never completely disappear. And it was precisely when the things that could not be fixed were still there, when the gaps that could not be filled still existed in every small corner of life, that Vince Gill gradually turned back to what had always been with him from the early days: music. But this time it was no longer just work, no longer just a career, but became the only way for him to say the things that ordinary words were not strong enough to carry, as if every song was a small door opening to a place where he could set down emotions that had been held back for too long. The songs he wrote and sang in this period were no longer purely performative, no longer created only to conquer the audience, but carried within them the traces of a man trying to understand himself, tracing the memories that had shaped his life to find a way to accept them. When he raised his voice in "Go Rest High on That Mountain," it was not just a song about departure, but a farewell to the losses he had witnessed, a way to face pain without needing to explain, and also a way for him to allow himself to be sad without having to hide it. Those melodies were not loud or dramatic in the way people usually expect from big stories. But that very simplicity made them touch a deeper place where real emotions did not need to be exaggerated to have meaning. For Vince, writing music gradually became an almost private act, a moment when he could sit alone with his guitar, uninterrupted by schedules or expectations, and let the thoughts he could not put into words find their own way, turning into lyrics and melodies, as if music was doing for him what he could not do directly facing the past without being swallowed by it. There were things he never said in interviews, never shared on stage, never told anyone in a clear way, but appeared very clearly in his music. In the way he held a note longer, in the way he paused in the middle of a passage, in the way his voice sometimes became thinner, as if touching a memory he had not yet fully let go. The audience might not know the exact story behind each song, but they felt it, because there is a truth in music that needs no explanation. When someone sings from real experience, the listener recognizes it even if they do not know the details. And that was precisely what made Vince Gill's music become more than songs. It became a form of communication, a way for him to connect with others, not through what he had achieved, but through what he had been through. What he had been through, what he had lost, and what he was still carrying. In those performance nights, when the lights shone down and the audience listened in silence, there were moments when Vince was no longer an artist performing, but a person sharing a very real part of himself. And in those moments, the distance between stage and audience nearly disappeared, because music did what words could not. It created a space where pain did not need to be explained to be understood, where memories did not need to be retold to be felt. But even when music helped him name those emotions, it did not erase them, did not make them disappear, but only gave him a way to live with them without being completely controlled by them, like a shelter he could return to when everything became too heavy. A place where he did not need to be strong, did not need to be perfect, only needed to be himself with everything still unfinished. And perhaps that was what Vince Gill gradually came to understand, that music was not a way to escape the past, but a way to carry it in a bearable way, that the songs were not answers but questions asked more gently, more acceptably. And in continuing to write and continuing to sing, he was not trying to complete something, but only finding a way to keep going, day by day, with what life had left him. And it was precisely when music became the place where he could say the things that could not be said that another paradox gradually became clear in Vince Gill's life, that while the world saw him as one of the kindest and most likable people in the music industry, a man who always appeared with a gentle smile, natural humility, and a soft way of treating everyone, inside he carried thoughts that no one could see, questions that no amount of applause could answer. In the eyes of the public, Vince was the image of sincerity, an artist who did not need to show off but was still respected, a man who seemed never to have lost himself amid fame, someone always ready to share the stage, always giving praise to others, always keeping just enough distance to not get caught up in the noise that many others could not avoid. And that was exactly what made him loved, not only for his music, but for the person he showed on the outside. But there was one thing very few people realized, and that was that this kindness was not only his nature, but also part of how he lived with himself, as if he was always trying to be better, gentler, more patient, not just for others, but because a part of him always felt he needed to be that way. The self-blaming thoughts did not come from a single event, but from everything he had been through the years. Not being with his family, the marriage that had ended, the decisions that even with reasons still left consequences, and all of that gradually created a way of seeing himself that he could not easily change. When every time he received love from the public, he not only felt grateful, but also felt a little something not entirely deserved, as if they were loving a version of him that they saw rather than the whole person he truly was. This did not make him withdraw from the world, but made him more careful with the way he appeared, as if every kind act, every gentle word, was not only how he treated others, but also how he tried to balance what he felt he had not done enough in the past. There were moments after leaving the stage when no one was around anymore, when there was no more music or lights. Vince sat alone and thought about all of that, not to torment himself in an extreme way, but as a habit that had formed. A way he reminded himself of what had passed and what he wanted to do better, even knowing that some things could not be changed. The contrast between the outside image and the inner self was not always clear because he never let it show in an easily noticeable way, but it existed in small details, in the way he paused a little longer before answering a question, in the way his voice sometimes lowered when mentioning family, in the way he chose not to talk about certain things even when he had the chance, as if there were parts of his story he did not want or could not bring into the light. What is worth noting is that he did not try to erase that contrast, but learned to live with it, accepting that people are not always unified between outside and inside, that one person can be both loved and carry doubts about himself, both an inspiration to others and feel he is not entirely worthy of it. And perhaps this was exactly what made Vince Gill closer in a different way. Not because he was perfect, but because he was not perfect, yet still continued to live, continued to be kind, continued to raise his voice in song whenever asked, as if it was not only a job, but a way for him to keep himself balanced among all the different parts of his being. In a world of carefully built images, where many stories are made simpler to be easily understood, Vince's story did not fit neatly into such a mold because it contained both respect and doubt, both peace and silences, and it was precisely in that complexity that he continued to move forward, not as someone who had resolved everything, but as someone who accepted that there would always be things that remained, and the important thing was not to eliminate them, but to learn not to let them stop him from continuing to become a better version of himself, even if that version might never be perfect. And then, when many people at that age had chosen to step back, to accept standing outside the lights to make way for new generations, Vince Gill instead continued to step onto the stage, not with the eagerness of someone just beginning, but with the calm of a man who had been through enough to understand that standing there was no longer to prove anything but to continue a part of himself that he could not separate from. The performances still happened, the halls still filled, and his voice, even though it now carried the marks of time, still kept the warmth and sincerity that made listeners pause. But there was one thing that had changed, that only those who listened really carefully could feel, and that was that every lyric now was no longer as light as before, no longer flowed as naturally as in the early years, but carried a different weight, as if behind every melody was a memory, a story, something he would never completely let go. When he joined the Eagles, one of the most iconic bands in American music, it was not only a big step in his career, but also another challenge. A new environment where he had to find a way to blend into a legacy that had existed for a very long time, replacing a position the public associated with deep memories. And in that role, Vince did not try to become a copy of anyone, but brought himself a voice that had been shaped by time, by experiences no one else could replace. But even when standing on such big stages, even when continuing to be recognized and welcomed, he no longer felt everything the way he had felt before, because a part of him had changed permanently, a part that had gone through losses, decisions, memories that could not be returned to, and that was present in the way he stepped out, in the way he held the guitar, in the way he looked down at the audience, as if searching for something that was no longer there. It was not that he did not love music. On the contrary, perhaps he loved it more than ever, but that love was no longer simple, no longer just joy or freedom, but had become a deeper, more complex connection, where every time he raised his voice was a time he touched what had shaped who he was, both the beautiful things and the things that made him pause a little longer before continuing. At an age when many seek lightness, Vince instead carried everything he had been through into every performance, not because he wanted to, but because it was unavoidable, because memories did not stay behind. They went with him, stepped onto the stage with him, existed in every note, every silence between songs. There were moments when the lights shone down and the audience clapped. He smiled, nodded, did everything an artist needed to do, but inside he might have been somewhere else, a place without sound, where there were only the thoughts he had carried for many years, things he never said out loud but that were always present. And perhaps that was exactly why people listening to him in this period felt something different, the sincerity that could not be faked, an emotion that did not need to be displayed but was still clear enough to touch them, because they were not only hearing a voice but listening to a life being told in the only way Vince Gill knew, through music. He still stood there, still continued, still did what he had done his whole life, but he was no longer the man of the early years, no longer carrying the lightness of someone who had never known loss, but a man who had been through enough to understand that continuing did not always mean everything was okay, but sometimes simply meant there was no other choice except to keep going. Even when every step carried a part of what had once hurt him, and when the shows gradually came to an end under softening lights, when the applause no longer rang out continuously as before, but gave way to longer silences, Vince Gill began to look back at his journey not through numbers or titles, but through what remained after everything. And in that view, no one could deny that he had achieved things very few people could reach: more than 20 Grammy Awards, dozens of songs that became part of an entire generation's memory, respect from the toughest colleagues, and a solid place in American music history where his name was mentioned not only for success, but also for a rare persistence and sincerity. But the more he looked back, the deeper he went into the years that had passed. Vince gradually understood that those achievements, no matter how great, could not give back the things he had unintentionally lost on the way there, that there were things that could not be measured by any award, could not be replaced by any fame, and could not be regained by any effort in the present. Time was one of them, the thing that had slipped away during tours, during recording sessions, during decisions that seemed right at the time but later left gaps that could not be filled. When he began to realize that the years he was not there were not just missed days, but parts of other people's lives that had happened without him, memories that had been created where he could only hear about them like a story, rather than being part of it. Presence, something he once thought he could make up for with returns, with gestures, with words, now stood out more clearly than ever as something irreplaceable, because there were moments that only had value when lived together, not when retold. And once they had passed, there was no way to live them again. Those gaps were not always clearly seen, not always spoken about, but they existed in the way he thought, in the way he paused longer when mentioning family, in the way he sometimes stared into space as if trying to recall something that had grown faint with time. And in all of that, there was one thing that had changed most clearly: silence. Not the silence of complete loneliness, but a kind of silence that had become part of life, a space he gradually grew familiar with, where there was no noise from the stage, no demands from outside, only himself and the thoughts he had carried for many years. In that silence, he did not always find answers, but he found something else: acceptance. Not acceptance that everything was okay, but acceptance that there were things that would never be fully resolved, that a life, no matter how successful, still had unfinished parts, incomplete parts, and the important thing was not to try to deny them, but to learn to live with them without letting them take away what still remained. Vince did not deny what he had achieved, did not downplay the efforts that had brought him to his current position, but he also did not let them cover up the truth that there were prices no one warned about, prices that only became clear when it was too late to choose again. And in realizing that, he did not become bitter but became quieter, like a man who had been through enough to understand that life is not a perfect story, but a chain of things gained and things traded. And sometimes what we hold on to is not what the world sees, but what we could not keep. And then, After everything that had passed, after the years when success and loss always walked side by side like two sides of the same life, Vince Gill still stood there at the age of 68, not as a perfect symbol, but as a real human being with everything still unfinished, still continuing to step onto the stage, still holding the familiar guitar, still raising the voice that had walked with him through every stage of his life, as if it was not only a job, but the one thing he had never lost, the one thing that remained when everything else had changed. He no longer tried to become the best version of himself in the way others expected, no longer chased the perfection he once thought was necessary, but accepted himself with all the shortcomings, the mistakes, the choices he could not go back on. And in that acceptance there was a different kind of strength, not loud, not needing proof, but enough for him to keep standing firm amid memories that never fully closed. Every time he appeared, every time he sang, it was no longer a simple performance, but a continuation, a way for him to carry everything that had happened without being pulled back by it, because he understood that what he had lost could not be replaced. But what he still had the ability to feel, the ability to love, the ability to connect through music, still had value, still enough to create something meaningful even if not perfect. There were nights when the stage lights dimmed and the audience listened in silence. Vince stood there, not only as an artist, but as a man who had been through enough to understand that continuing was not always easy, that there were days he still thought about the past, still remembered what he could not change, still carried questions without clear answers. But he did not let those things stop him from living on, did not let them make him stop, because he knew that stopping brought nothing but more regret. Music, through all those years, never left him, never judged him, never required him to be perfect, but was simply there like a loyal friend, a place he could return to whenever he needed, a place he could set down emotions he could not carry forever. And precisely because of that, no matter how life changed, no matter how many upheavals he went through, music remained a thread that kept him connected to himself, kept him standing firm amid everything that had happened and was still happening. The image of Vince Gill at the age of 68 was no longer the image of a man climbing to the peak, but the image of a man walking through time, carrying everything he had been through, not hiding it, not denying it, but also not letting it completely define who he was, as if every step was a choice to choose to continue, to choose not to collapse, to choose to keep what could still be kept. And perhaps that was what made his story not only a story of success, but a story of existence, of how one person could keep living, keep loving, keep raising his voice in song, even when his heart would never fully heal. Because there were wounds that did not need to disappear for a life to continue. And there were people like Vince Gill who did not become strong because they felt no pain, but because they learned to walk with that pain day after day until the journey itself became the most precious thing they could leave behind. The story of Vince Gill is not a perfect epic, but a journey that makes people fall silent upon realizing the real price of success when a man can stand on stage with more than 20 Grammy Awards, respected by all of America, yet carry gaps from his own family that nothing can fill. What makes this story heartbreaking does not lie in loud tragedies, but in very real and everyday details. The times he was absent from important moments in his daughter's life, the evenings returning home but no longer feeling he belonged, or the moment he left in silence, and the image of his child standing in the back became a memory that never left. It was precisely those seemingly small things that accumulated into a distance that could not be mended, and by the time he realized it, time, the most precious thing, had not waited. But what is admirable about Vince is not that he made no mistakes, but the way he kept living, after clearly understanding those mistakes, when he did not run away, did not deny them, but carried everything into his music, turning things that could not be said into songs like Go Rest High on That Mountain, as a way to face himself. For American society, where individual success is often placed first, this story is a profound reminder that career, fame, or money cannot replace presence in the most important relationships, and that being there at the right time is sometimes more important than achieving any accomplishment. The lesson here is not to give up dreams, but to understand that every choice has its price. And if we are not careful, we can achieve everything the world sees, but lose the things that only when lost do we realize are truly irreplaceable. If Vince Gill's story makes you pause, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to cherish a man who has lived truly with both glory and wounds that cannot be healed. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to listen to stories where sometimes silence speaks more than music.